I'm Steve Courtney, and this, of course, is the Mark Twain House and Museum's free after work, or after whatever you do all day, lecture series on Twainian subjects. The series is now entering its 5th year, and it takes its name from Twain's own lecture posters, which, as you probably know by now, were headed, "The trouble begins at 8." Or in some cases, as I understand it, the orgy begins at 8. But whether we have an orgy or not depends on you. And of course, we don't start at 8. We start at 5:30, being Hartford in the land of steady habits and early bedtimes. Tonight, we are privileged to have Martin Naparstek, author with Michel Cardula of the first biography of Olivia Langdon Clemens, a figure who loomed large and lived large in the Clemens household when they lived here in the house nearby. She is, to put it mildly, the heroine of this historic site, her personality suffusing all Mark Twain's memories of his life here, indeed of his life in general, during which their marriage bore out the promise of a letter he wrote her just before they tied the knot in 1870. He wrote, "The 4th of February will be the mightiest day in the history of our lives, the holiest," this is Mark Twain, "and the most generous toward us both, for it makes of 2 fractional lives a whole. It gives to 2 purposeless lives a work and doubles the strength of each whereby to perform it. It gives to 2 questioning natures a reason for living and something to live for. It will give a new gladness to the sunshine, a new fragrance to the flowers, a new beauty to the earth, a new mystery to life, and Livy, it will give a new revelation to love, a new depth to sorrow, a new impulse to worship. In that day, the scales will fall from our eyes, and we shall look upon a new world. Speed it." She had a tremendous role in the siting and planning of the Hartford house, and of course her husband wouldn't have been able to build the house at all if it had not been for her family wealth. I sometimes tell visitors that if it hadn't been for the fame of her husband, we might be calling this the Olivia Clemens house. We're departing from our usual Trouble Begins format, the lecture and then questions, in that Marty and I are going to have a conversation about Livy Clemens. I realize today also that this conversation will be 2 men talking about a woman. And because I think I noticed there are some women here, please feel free at any time to join into the conversation. There may be things that we don't think of. But we're going to have a conversation, which is a format that we've tried from time to time, and which Marty said he'd like to try. He's spoken many times, but we'd like to try this time. But first, some important details. Like Mark Twain and his house, we couldn't have built this series up without generous donors, and my wife is not rich. Our primary donor is First Niagara Foundation, Inc., and tonight's Trouble is also supported by Connecticut Explored magazine, Hot Tomatoes Restaurant, Garlic Bread Forever, and the Friends of the Mark Twain House and Museum, Coffee Forever. And as always, we have ASL signing provided by the energetic students of the Interpreting 1 class in Northwestern Connecticut Community College's Interpreter Preparation Program. And as they say on public television, important financial support comes from people like you. At the end of the event, there will be 2 great ways to help us. One, by dropping $1 or 2 into the baskets thrust at you by Diane and David and Kim on the way out, or some combination of them. And the other, of course, by filling out your little evaluation on the high table out there. If you liked it, we can tell our funders you liked it and quote you. And if you didn't like it, you can tell us and we can improve. Coming up next month, May 14th, another first biography of an extraordinary Nook Farm woman, Isabella Beecher Hooker, the fighter for women's rights, the powerful personality and spiritualist in a presentation by Susan Campbell, whose book on Hooker, Tempest Tossed, her biography of Hooker, will be released at a special publication at the event at the Stowe Center next week. That is next week at April 16th at 7 p.m. over at the Stowe Center. You can go to the launch party for Tempest Tossed with Susan. But next month you can hear a little about Isabella Beecher Hooker and Mark Twain. She was his landlady when he first moved to Hartford. She was his friend. She was his bitter enemy for a while. And then a friend again, and finally, as I understand it, he was one of the pallbearers at her funeral. But let's get to Martin. Martin Naparstek has published 2 novels, War Song and A Hero's Welcome, a collection of short stories, a book of writing advice, a book about writer Richard Yates, a history of the role sex played in America's westward expansion. I want to ask 1 or 2 things about that. And of course, this is Mark Twain. He writes, and he's just told me he's finishing a biography of Susan B. Anthony, so this is not the only woman he's writing about. He writes full-time, lives in Rochester, New York. He says that being a writer was his second choice for a career, but nobody would sign him to a professional baseball contract. Michelle Cardula, who's his co-author, is editor and publisher of Lake Effect magazine in Rochester and a contributor to numerous other magazines, but she could not be here tonight because she is on her honeymoon in Costa Rica. As I mentioned, we'll be doing this conversation style, and so I'll take my seat. Of course, afterward, there will be an opportunity for a book signing out by our store. So let me do this. Okay, can you still hear me?
No.
No. Right. How's that? Better? Not there. How about that?
Does the light go on, please?
It's green.
How do you sign no?
We could speak very loud.
There we go.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, he's all right. I'm not.
You need a little more volume.
Yeah, I don't see any volume on
There's a higher control on you, though.
here. There is. I can talk loudly. How about that?
Back and forth.
We could do that too. In fact, let's do this. Okay. I have things written down, but I think things will get more conversational. As I say, we'll go along for a little while, and then you can join in, rather than sort of stopping somewhere and having a Q&A beginning. But let me ask you first, Marty. You are not. You are a man, obviously, with a wealth of interests. You have ranging from baseball to sex and westward expansion to Richard Yates and an experience in fiction and writing. And I just wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about where you came from and how you got to this place. And there you are.
If I don't like one of his questions, I can just not give him the microphone back. Well, quick bio stuff. I was born in Connecticut, actually, Putnam, Connecticut. Left here when I was 2 or 3 years old, moved to Brooklyn, and then a couple years after that, moved to Exeter, Pennsylvania, which is about halfway between Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, and that's where I grew up. And went to college locally there, Wilkes College, now Wilkes University, got a master's in creative writing at DePaul University in Indiana, and then kicked around a lot. I worked on 3 different newspapers in Pennsylvania as a reporter, And I taught part-time in college for 26 years, 10 different colleges, 3 different states, Pennsylvania, New York, and Utah. You would tell my students I wasn't any good, but it was cheap, so they kept hiring me. I've always considered myself primarily a writer, because as I told Steve, the baseball scouts weren't good enough at their jobs. You know, mostly I've written a lot of freelance stuff for newspapers and for many magazines. I've been published in more than 100 different publications. Somewhere along the line,